Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and today I want to talk about some past NBA draft picks that completely saved a handful of franchises. The reason that this came to mind is because of my most recent video about Luka Doncic, and I got to thinking about the fact that we might look back on that draft pick throughout NBA history and see that as the turning point of the Mavericks franchise, because they were certainly on a bit of a downhill trend before that pick. And so I went ahead and looked through NBA history and came up with 5 players that when they were drafted by their franchise really turned around the fate of that team. I will admit that this is a bit more of a contemporary list and there's a lot of other guys to pick from, so if you have some other people that you think should be on this list, then be sure to leave that down in the comment section below. But with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. Number 1, Paul George, the Indiana Pacers. First up is a guy that's kind of a weird one simply because Paul George was obviously very good for the Pacers when he was first drafted, but he also decided he didn't want to be there anymore and requested a trade. So it might be kind of weird to think of him as a guy that quote unquote saved the franchise, but when you look at where they were headed in the direction that they were going before he was drafted and then where they went to afterwards, you'll see why I included him on this list. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the Pacers had some really good teams and they made the playoffs every single year from 1998 to 2006. But after that, from 2006 up until the year George was drafted in 2010, the Pacers really got stuck in the middle and were winning between 32 to 36 games every single year with a team that included guys like a young Danny Granger and TJ Ford, but really weren't at the top of the Eastern Conference. And I can specifically remember at the time a lot of articles coming out just talking about what exactly the Pacers were going to do. They were a small market team with a proud heritage, and they just didn't really seem to have much of a direction, and because of their payroll and their roster at the time, they also didn't really seem to have very much upward mobility within the Eastern Conference. Although initially he wasn't nearly as much of a contributor as he would become, they made the playoffs in George's rookie season and went on a string of a handful of consecutive playoff appearances, including making the conference finals in back-to-back years, and those teams were very, very close to making the NBA Finals. Those teams obviously being in that era of Pacers basketball where they were led by George and they also had Roy Hibbert under Frank Vogel when they were a very good defensive team, and they just kept running into the brick wall that was LeBron James and the Miami Heat. And then you get into this weird time period where George obviously suffered that awful injury, and then he ended up requesting a trade from Indiana and was moved to the Thunder. But even after that, in that time period after he was traded, a lot of the team's success that they're currently having can still be traced back to George. The reason I phrase it that way is simply because George at least gave the franchise the courtesy of letting them know that he didn't plan on re-signing with Indiana, and as a result they had enough time to move him for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis, which are 2 of the key pieces to the current team that they have. So in a kind of weird and roundabout way, all of the success that the Indiana Pacers have had since 2010, the year that George was drafted, and especially since he reached the peak of his powers as an NBA player, can be traced to that decision to draft him in 2010. And in essence, he saved that franchise from the mediocre fate that they continued to face year after year. Number 2, Giannis Antetokounmpo, the Milwaukee Bucks. In my mind, this next entry is going to be a controversial one simply because Giannis hasn't provided anything especially concrete to the franchise, at least in terms of playoff series victories, but it's more so about the hope that he provides the Bucks moving forward. After all, this is a franchise that hasn't won a playoff series since 2001, which was also the last time that they managed to win 50 games. And they've been a consistently mediocre team throughout the 2000s, and even some of their better teams just couldn't get it done in the playoffs. And to this point in the Giannis era, that is still true. They still have not won a playoff series, they still have not won 50 games, they've gotten off to a very good start this season, but you don't really know where they're going to end up. But you could also make the case that they should have beaten the Celtics in the first round of the playoffs last year, and that's a team that ended up going to the Eastern Conference Finals if they just had a better coach in place. They fired Jason Kidd mid-season, and then they replaced him with Joe Prunty, and the gap between the coaching skill in that first round series against the Celtics was pretty evident. Now, I'm not going to give him a complete pass on that playoff series last season, and especially moving forward if it continues to be an issue for the franchise in this era, but the point that I'm making is that ever since Giannis has become this bright new shining star for the city of Milwaukee, a perennial MVP candidate, an All-NBA guy every single year, and a guy that loves the city and wants to be in Milwaukee for a long time, it has completely changed their outlook. Before he got there, as I said, they just weren't very good. They weren't ever able to put it together in the postseason. But now that he's there, you can feel this tangible bit of success that even though it hasn't translated into anything concrete, once again in terms of a playoff series victory, you feel like it's going to happen eventually just because of how good Giannis is. And for a small market team and city like the Milwaukee Bucks, that's not a small thing, and it's completely changed the direction of their franchise. Just think about how differently you would look at the Bucks right now if they hadn't made that choice to draft Giannis in the middle of the first round, and how much worse their long-term outlook would look. But now, since they did make that decision to draft him, they have the possibility to be one of the powers in the Eastern Conference moving forward and a potential finals contender so long as Giannis is still there. And to me, that is the very definition of saving and turning around a franchise. Number 3, Kevin Garnett, the Minnesota Timberwolves. Next up is a guy that didn't really save the franchise so much as he really is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and that's Kevin Garnett. If you go back throughout the entire franchise history, which began in 1989, the Timberwolves have made the playoffs exactly one time, in a season in which Kevin Garnett was not on the roster, and that was just last season. Before he got there in 1995, they had never won 30 games, and once he was drafted, they did miss the playoffs in his first season, but they made it the next 8 years. Although the first 7 they lost in the first round every year, and then finally made the conference finals in 2004, the year that KG won the MVP. And then of course, after a few frustrating years to end his Timberwolves tenure, he was traded to Boston. But if you're going to look at any single season, with the exception of last year, that you can say was any kind of a success for the Minnesota Timberwolves, Kevin Garnett is a big part of it. He basically is the franchise. In a very similar fashion to the next guy that I'm going to talk about, this team is irrelevant without those years in which KG was there, and then ever since he left, that pattern has continued, once again with the exception of last season. And just like Giannis, think about how differently the Timberwolves franchise history would be if they never picked KG. And to me, that absolutely makes him deserving of a spot on this list. Number 4, LeBron James, the Cleveland Cavaliers. This next one was pretty easy, and you probably assumed it was going to be on this list because basically, and this is a really harsh way to put it, but when the Cleveland Cavaliers have had LeBron James on their roster this century, they've been relevant. When he hasn't been on the roster, nobody's really cared about them. Again, I know that's a harsh way to put it, and I know that they've had success in the past without LeBron, but specifically this century, if he's not on the team, they're basically not relevant at all. This is obviously a bit of a different circumstance than most of the other players on this list, simply because he's had 2 different stints with the team. But consider this, since the 1998-1999 season, the Cleveland Cavaliers' highest single season win total in a year in which LeBron James was not on the roster is 33. In the 2013-14 season, the season immediately before he returned to Cleveland. And that is one of 3 total seasons in which they won 30 games in that time span without him on the roster. And when it comes to LeBron James, more so than any other player on this list, he holds an extreme amount of significance not only to the Cavaliers as a franchise, but to the city of Cleveland, because he is the only reason that they were able to break their extremely long championship drought across all the major professional sports. And again, I do want to make a point to say that I recognize that the Cavaliers have had success in franchise history without LeBron, but in terms of the direction they were going this century and how he turned that around once he got there, he certainly saved that franchise, and really, he's done it twice. Number 5, Patrick Ewing, the New York Knicks. And last up is the least contemporary member of this list, and that is for a franchise that, to put it nicely, simply hasn't been very good for any consistent period of time since the turn of the century. And if you're looking for any kind of consistent, sustainable success for the New York Knicks immediately prior to that, you're going to point to Patrick Ewing's tenure with the team, as he is responsible for an incredibly long run of consistent success for the franchise, including 2 trips to the NBA Finals. Ewing was drafted in 1985, and within 2 seasons, the Knicks started a streak of 14 consecutive years with a playoff appearance. That is an incredible impact to have on a team, both in an immediate sense as well as over the long term. But interestingly enough, it's also significant how much Ewing leaving the team in 2000 has affected their success or lack thereof. Since 2000, when Ewing left the Knicks, they have had a total of 3 40-win seasons, 1 50-win season, 5 total playoff appearances, and 1 playoff series victory in the nearly 20 years since he left the Knicks. Now, probably more so than any other team on this list, the Knicks are an iconic franchise and they don't need saving from any one player. They're always going to have a strong fan base and they're always going to be a strong part of the league. but in terms of a tangible on-court aspect, Patrick Ewing completely turned around the franchise when he got there, from a team whose win total was in the lower 20s to a 14-year-long stretch of success that the team has not come close to duplicating since he left. And that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, I understand that this is a very modern version of this list, and there are a handful of other guys throughout NBA history that could have been on this. I just decided to pick these 5. But if you have anybody else that you would like to see on the list, I'd love to do a commenters edition of this in the future. So if you have one, put it down below in the comments and I will show it on screen if I make another version moving forward. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.